Well, when I came last year, I think it was December last year I came, and I was asked to share a little bit about the work of the Leprosy Mission. The Leprosy Mission is the charity that I work for, and we're ultimately seeking to end leprosy, a disease which isn't just biblical. It exists in many countries around the world today where extreme poverty thrives. And I just wanted to say thank you. Earlier this year, we received a really wonderful gift from yourselves as a fellowship towards that work, and it really is humbling to be able to partner with you in that. I just wanted to give you a bit of an update in terms of what that money went towards. So about 18 months ago, our CEO Peter and my boss, the head of fundraising, went to a place called Odisha on the eastern kind of coast of India. Odisha was made famous, I suppose isn't the really word, but about 20 years ago, there was a missionary family who were working there in these leprosy colonies, and very tragically, some Hindu extremists were not happy about this. They killed the husband and the two children of this family. It's really awful. Burned them alive in their car, and really as a result of that, most NGOs, charities, pulled out of the region because it was just too dangerous. As a result of that, it's really been left to its own devices. And my colleagues were able to visit there 18 months ago, and they said it was really like going back in time. They haven't seen such poverty, and particularly the impact of leprosy just left untreated. And in about 70 colonies, they said there was no healthcare really to speak of, so people were just suffering as they would have done 50, 100 years ago with the effects of leprosy. What was remarkable, though, they said, was even in those communities, the work of Graham Staines was the missionary. You could see the work that God had done through him and his family, and blessed, because there were Christian communities, Christian leprosy communities. And so there were, most of the people they met had really nothing. They survive on begging. They're isolated. They're stigmatized. And yet they had this little church building, and they would gather to meet and to pray and to sing praise to God. So it was really, I think they were really moved. Probably the most moving place they've ever visited, they said. But also a place of desperate poverty. So a project was put in place to go into that area, working with a local partner, a Christian organisation in that region called Brighter Futures, led by a wonderful chap called Victor, who runs an orphanage in that area as well for young girls. And they've gone in, and in the last 6 months that the project has been set up, they've arranged 3 health camps. So this is where essentially everyone can just come along. There's doctors, there's nurses, and get treated or get assessed and then get the treatment they need. Nearly 50 people have been treated for ulcers, and so ulcers occur with leprosy because you lose the feeling in your extremities. So you cut yourself or you burn yourself, and then you don't realise, and it gets infected, and because you live in poverty, you can't get it treated, and ulcers ultimately lead to amputations. But they've been able to see over 50 patients. They've treated over 150 people to give them self-care kits, so clean bandages, clean water, things that they can use at home to treat themselves. Over 100 protective footwear. So one of the things, again, if you can't feel with your feet as you cut them, so you need to wear these special protective footwear to protect your feet. They've raised up 6 volunteers to be leprosy champions in that region from the local community, so they will advocate on behalf of people with leprosy, and they're looking to raise more. The homes were in a dreadful state. There's a couple that particularly that comes to mind, that they met, a couple of older ladies, and they said, they regularly get all snakes and scorpions come into their home at night because the roofs are falling in, there's asbestos in the roofs. 30 new homes are now under construction, and kitchen gardens have been created, over 300 in the vicinity, so that they can start to grow their own food, and they'll be given goats and cows so that then they can become self-sustaining. And through it all, there's a pastor who's linked to the charity called Pastor Elisha, and his heart really is to use this as a means to share the gospel. And And he says it's been a wonderful opportunity to go in and not just tell people of the love of Jesus, but practically demonstrate it. So that's in addition, so please do keep praying for that work. That's a project that's going to carry on for probably another 5 or 6 years, I think. It's such a vast project. But thank you so much for being a part of that, and please do keep praying for them. Well, if you would turn in your Bibles once more to Zephaniah chapter 2. Zephaniah. I'll give you an extra moment to find it, because that's what I would need. It's probably not the most well-thumbed passage. Just while you're finding it, let me just give you a little bit of context, because that's often helpful when we go to the minor prophets. So Zephaniah is a prophet, and he's coming to bring his word in the time of King Josiah. Now, Josiah might be a name that's very familiar, because he was the last of the good kings of Judah. He became king very young, and during his time he sought to really change the sinfulness of the nature by heeding God's warning and getting rid of these foreign idols. And that seems to be partly as a result of Zephaniah's message. Sadly, as we know, that didn't last long, and by the time his son came on the throne, the evil came back, and only probably 20 years or so after these events, the kingdom was lost to Babylon. So what's the structure here? Well, chapter 1, we see God speaking directly to his people, and it's very blunt, it's very direct. He comes in judgment. You can see verse 2, I will utterly consume everything from the face of the land. There is judgment here, God's justice at a sinful people who have just ignored him and are going their own way. And then in chapter 2, you'll see the first 3 verses. You'll see there's hope. We're not going to focus on those tonight. We're going to look particularly at verses 4 through to 15. But there is hope. We'll read those first. And then we come to verse 4. And now the attention switches to the nations surrounding Judah. So the nation of Israel, God's people, when they split the kingdom of Israel, they've already gone into captivity, taken away by Syria, and so there's just Judah left. And now that he speaks to these 4 places, so the Philistines, you get these cities mentioned in verse 4 and 5, Gaza, Ashdod, and this is the people of the Philistines. They're kind of, you might have a map in your Bible, but if you imagine a map of Judah, Israel, down there to the west of Judah, that's where the Philistines were, and they'd been a continual thorn in the side of God's people. And then he goes on and talks about the Moabites and the Ammonites in verse 8, and they're people groups who were just to the east of God's people, and again, they had been a continual thorn, seeking to lead God's people astray. We get a reference to Cush, or it's Ethiopians here in verse 12. That's helpful, because just to give you an idea as to where that is, so that's south, as you kind of go down past Egypt. The Ethiopians are also mentioned here. And then finally, the final area is the kingdom of Assyria. And that really is the big bad kingdom of the day. They're the ones who have taken Israel, the nation of Israel, into captivity already. They're to the north and to the east. And they're mighty and they're powerful. Nineveh is their capital, and they have wrought havoc on all the nations around, and they're threatening Judah. So there's a bit of context now for chapter 2 of Zephaniah. Verse 1, gather yourselves together, yes, gather together, O undesirable nation, before the decree is issued, or the day passes like chaff. Before the Lord's fierce anger comes upon you, before the day of the Lord's anger comes upon you. Seek the Lord's, all you meek of the earth, who have upheld his justice. Seek righteousness, seek humility. It may be that you will be hidden in the day of the Lord's anger. For Gaza shall be forsaken, and Ashkelon desolate, and shall drive out Ashdod at noonday, and Ekron shall be uprooted. Woe to the inhabitants of the sea coast, the nation of the Cherethites. The word of the Lord is against you, O Canaan, land of the Philistines. I will destroy you, so there will be no inhabitant. The seacoast shall be pastures, with shelters for shepherds and folds for flocks. The coast shall be for the remnant of the house of Judah. They shall feed their flocks there. In the houses of Ashkelon they shall lie down at evening, for the Lord their God will intervene for them and return their captives. I have heard the reproach of Moab and the insults of the people of Ammon, with which they have reproached my people and made arrogant threats against their borders. Therefore, as I live, says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, surely Moab shall be like Sodom, and the people of Ammon like Gomorrah, overrun with weeds and salt pits, and a perpetual desolation. The residue of my people shall plunder them, and the remnant of my people shall possess them. This they shall have for their pride, because they have reproached and made arrogant threats against the people of the Lord of hosts. The Lord will be awesome to them, for he will reduce to nothing all the gods of the earth. People shall worship him, each one from his place, indeed all the shores of the nations. You Ethiopians also, you shall be slain by my sword. And he will stretch out his hand against the north, destroy Assyria, and make Nineveh a desolation, as dry as the wilderness. The herd shall lie down in her midst, every beast of the nation, both the pelican and the bittern, shall lodge on the capitals of her pillars. Their voice shall sing in the windows. Desolation shall be at the threshold, for he will lay bare the cedar work. This is the rejoicing city that dwelt securely, that said in her heart, I am it, and there is none besides me. How she has become a desolation, a place for beasts to lie down. Everyone who passes by her shall hiss and shake his fist. Well, we ask that the Lord would bless his word, and we'll study that in a moment. But I don't know if any of you, at about 3 o'clock this afternoon, had a very strange noise in your home. I was certainly shocked, even though I'd been heeding the warnings that this national alert was going to take place. So if you have a mobile phone at 3 o'clock, everyone was going to make this awful loud noise. Did people get that? You did? Yeah, okay. It was just a warning. That's what they were reminding us of, what it would be like if there was a significant issue. That's a little practice. Now, in some parts of the world, they obviously have used this kind of warning system. So recently in Hawaii, you might remember there was a tsunami warning. So there'd been a tsunami, or an earthquake, I should say, off the coast of Russia. And there in Hawaii, they'd all had these, when the sensors detected the earthquake, all these alerts on people's phones went off. Sirens were blaring, these text messages sent, and the message there wasn't a practice. It said, you've got to get to higher ground now. You've got to go. It's a warning. That's what it is. When you get one of those messages, it's meant to be a warning. Something big is coming, or something big is happening, and you've got to take action because the danger is real. This isn't pretend. And that warning is in fact a good thing, isn't it? In that instance, if you're in Hawaii and you hear that alert, that's a good thing, that warning going off, because it's telling you about the danger that's imminent, and it also tells you how to escape that danger. Well, that's what Zephaniah is. It's a warning siren to God's people, Judah. It tells them, Zephaniah comes and, inspired by God, he tells them that there is danger ahead, and it's danger that they're heading right into. But it also tells them that there is a way of escape. There is an escape for them. Now, as I mentioned a minute ago, the first chapter of Zephaniah is really focused on God's own people, and he's dealing with his own people there in really strong judgment for their sin. But then we get to chapter 2 and verse 4. As I mentioned, the first 3 verses are kind of linked actually to the first part, and it is remarkable. You think of all of their sin and their wickedness, and yet God says, but there's still time to repent, verses 1 to 3. If you seek God, or you humble of the earth, God might perhaps conceal you from his anger. And then we get to verse 4, and now God looks at the nations around. And while we see these 4 different nations, what we also notice in this chapter is that God is still at the centre. So it's a chapter that's all about God, and it's how God deals with sin. I'm going to see 3 things tonight. We'll see that God rules supremely. We're going to see that God judges impartially, and then we'll see that God preserves faithfully. So even in judgment, mercy is at work. This is a chapter that is all about God. So firstly, we see that God rules supremely. We've had a think about who those 4 nations are, and they're nations that have been enemies of God for a long time. They've caused many problems. But here in verse 11 of chapter 2, we see ultimately what their end is. I'm reading from the CSB as I preach, but as we went through, it's very similar. The Lord will be terrifying to them when he starves all the gods of the earth. Then all the distant coasts and islands of the nations will bow in worship to him, each in its own place. So if I was to ask you, where are those nations now? Where is the nation, the land of the Philistines? Where are the Ammonites and the Moabites? Where's the people of Cush, Ethiopia? Where's the kingdom of Assyria? And they're gone, aren't they? They're long gone. They're nations which don't exist anymore, because God shows here he will judge nations. He will judge the nations because he is in control. I don't know if you've ever been in a thunderstorm whilst you're on a plane, and that can be a pretty terrifying thing, can't it? And there's thunder and there's lightning going, and perhaps there's turbulence and the plane is shaking. And from your perspective, in the back of the plane, or my perspective, because it's definitely true of me, I would be scared. I'd be really terrified. And yet, what you don't see in that moment is the pilots. So the pilots are there flying the plane, and they've had thousands of hours of training to fly planes in storms. They've probably flown in hundreds of storms before. They know their plane really well. They know what it does and what they need to do to get it through safely. And it may not feel like it to you, but to them, they're in control. They're flying their plane. There's no issue. They're not worried at all. Now, for the people of Judah, they are this, in worldly terms, this tiny nation. They're covering this very small area of the map. And all around them are these tribes and these nations and these people groups and these empires that could cause them no end of problems, and they do. And they should have had a lot to be concerned about. That's realistic. They should have recognised that without God, they were in big trouble. And yet, just like Israel, that splinter of the nation that had gone before and been taken into captivity, never to return by Assyria, Judah, in its arrogance, they kept forgetting who they were dependent upon. And instead of humbling themselves before this God, this mighty, powerful God who ruled the nations, they trusted in the wrong things. They trusted in their own strength, in their own alliances, in the deals that they could do with these nations. And yet the reality was their survival, it didn't depend at all upon their military might, upon any great political treaties, upon the strength of the king. It depended entirely upon the mercy and the grace of a God who was ultimately all-powerful. And if you think, this is the God who had brought them out of Egypt. So he'd rescued them from Egypt. He'd then led them through the desert. He'd taken them into the promised land. He'd come and brought peace to the nation as they'd conquered that land. They should have known, they should have seen that, look, it is God who rules history. It's God. He rules supremely. When God wills, nobody, nothing, no leaders, no presidents, no prime ministers can stand in his way. He's in control, not just of their nation, but of all nations. Assyria was one of the most fearsome enemies, kingdoms that the world had ever seen to this point. It stretched from modern-day Iraq to Turkey, up in the north, and then down to the Nile Delta. This huge, vast kingdom. But what's the message that God has for them? Well, verse 13. He will stretch out his hand against the north and destroy Assyria. He will make Nineveh a desolate ruin, dry as the desert. Verse 15, this is a jubilant city that lives in security, that thinks to herself, I exist and there is no one else. What a desolation she has become. A place for wild animals to lie down. Everyone who passes by her scoffs and shakes his fist. There's this great kingdom, this massive city, Nineveh. And yet in just a few years' time, what would happen? Well, the Babylonians and the Medes together would come and they would take over. They would conquer Assyria. Nineveh itself would be leveled. It would be destroyed, never to exist again. This powerful nation, empire, gone. Now there's not a trace, just some archaeological evidence. And over 2,500 years later, it's the same story, isn't it? Nations rise, empires come, and they go, and they fall. And who is ultimately ruling in this world? Well, it's God's. It's God's. For all of these mighty and powerful leaders and rulers, one kingdom endures, one kingdom will never end. One king determines the fate of all of those other empires. And who is it? Well, Psalm 2 gives us the answer. Psalm 2, if you want to turn there. It says this, the kings of the earth take their stand, and the rulers conspire together against the Lord and his anointed one. The one enthroned in heaven laughs. The Lord ridicules them. Then he speaks to them in his anger and terrifies them in his wrath. Verse 6, I have installed my king on Zion, my holy mountain. The king there that God has installed on Zion. Who is that king? It's Jesus, his son, the Son of God, God's anointed. And he's not just any old king. He's not just a king who comes along. He is the king. He's the King of kings. And he rules supreme. He rules over all. And no one, nothing can stand in his way. I don't know if you ever feel a bit despondent in this life. It's very easy to. Particularly as we look at our news and we see some of the things that are going on. We see some of the situations in our world. It's chaotic, or it can be chaotic. In most places, most countries are hostile to the gospel in one form or another. Certainly in our nation, those who have power and influence in who lead, they are firmly set against God and against the things that God says are good. And we can look at that and we can feel overwhelmed at times. But Zephaniah 2 reminds us that God is not absent. He's not lost control. He's certainly not indifferent to what is happening, to what is going on. No, he cares, and he is in control. Empires rise and they fall and collapse at his word. The proud are brought low. The arrogant are silenced. And ultimately everyone, including the highest of kings and presidents, they're going to one day be held to account for their wickedness before a holy God. And as this happens all through human history, God's kingdom, through Jesus Christ, his King, is on the throne, and he's ruling. And he's ruling today. So the message here is to live confidently. Live with confidence. As we look at what the Apostle Paul says to Timothy, in his letter to Timothy, we're going to see what his confidence is in. Now, Paul was writing in a time where the Roman Empire are mighty and powerful, one of the biggest empires the world has ever seen. Paul lives and he serves in that hostile territory in the Roman Empire, and he sees the enemies of the gospel that come. They're all around. He sees followers of Jesus being terrible things, imprisoned, beaten up, ultimately executed. He's there waiting to be executed as he's writing to Timothy. And yet Paul's confidence is not in the things around him. They're not things that concern him, because he knows who's really in control. And in chapter 1, verse 12, as he's been reminding Timothy of the power of God through the gospel, he tells him of the suffering that will come with this, but that Jesus brings life through his death. And in 2 Timothy 1 verse 12 he says this, I'm not ashamed, because I know whom I believed, and am persuaded that he is able to guard what has been entrusted to me until that day. He's been given life, new life with God forever. And nothing can take that away. No kingdom of the world. Paul faces beatings and rejection and prison, and ultimately he's going to be put to death, and yet he just lives with this unshakable confidence, not because the world around him was safe. In fact, the opposite is true. His faith is because God is sovereign. God's sovereign, and Jesus' kingdom endures forever. And it will do. And it's the same for you and me today. Whatever your situation, whatever your place that is going on at the moment, you need to trust the God who rules supremely. So that's the first lesson we see from this chapter. Secondly, we see that God judges impartially. He judges impartially. His judgment is universal, and it is completely just. I don't know if you've ever had to look after children who are not your own. Now, when that happens, if they do something wrong, maybe this is just me, but I tend to deal with them not in the same way I would as if they were my own children. So recently we had a birthday party at our home for our youngest, and there was a game they were playing in the living room where we've got this kind of big plant thing in a big pot with lots of soil in it, and there was a child who was just being reckless. Well, they'd just been a child, I suppose, and they knocked over this plant and soil went everywhere, and they run off before you can do anything. Now, if that had been my child, I probably would have dealt with it in a slightly different way to the way that I dealt with it to this child. It was quite laid back, let's say. And maybe we look at this and we think, is that how God's dealing here? Does God deal with sin differently with his people to those who are not his? We've seen in chapter 1, or you can see in chapter 1, God judges the sins of his people. But in verses 8 to 10 of chapter 2, we see how God speaks directly to the Moabites and the Ammonites. And he says this: I've heard the taunting of Moab and the insults of the Ammonites, who have threatened my people and threatened their territory. Therefore, as I live, this is the declaration of the Lord of armies, the God of Israel: Moab will be like Sodom, and the Ammonites like Gomorrah, a place overgrown with weeds, a salt pit, and a perpetual wasteland. The remnant of my people will plunder them. The remainder of my nation will dispossess them. Now, we could have picked any one of these four nations that we see in this passage, but it's the same. The verdict is the same. What happens? God sees sin. He sees sin in action being committed. And God hates sin. He hates all sin. And therefore God judges sin. And that pattern, God sees sin, God hates sin, and God judges sin. That's the pattern wherever sin is found, whether it's in those who should know better, like the people of Judah, or those who don't. Now, why is that response? Why is God consistent in that way? Well, it's because he's holy. Because God is holy. He's not indifferent to pride. He's not indifferent to cruelty, to injustice, to rebellion against him. He doesn't just shrug off sin. Sometimes we can do that, can't we? We can make light of sin. But he doesn't. He doesn't laugh at it. He doesn't tolerate it. He doesn't indulge it or compromise with it or kind of just dwell with it on the edges. No, God hates sin because it's a rejection of his goodness. Sin is a distortion of the right order of things that he has made, that he made perfectly. And because it's centered on his very holiness, on his glory. And therefore sin separates us from him. See, for us, sometimes as we react to wrongdoing, we can perhaps lose control. I've certainly done that. You overreact, you become really angry, you become emotional because it's affected me in some way. You've hurt me, you've damaged me. But that's not God's hatred at sin. It's not an overreaction. His anger isn't unstable as ours can be. His anger flows from his holy character. So simply who he is, his anger at sin is because he cannot tolerate sin in any way. And so to leave sin unpunished, well, that would make him unjust. It would actually it would cease to make him God. his very holiness demands a response, and therefore that response is the same wherever sin is present. The temptation that we have, I think, when we come to a passage like this, maybe you've heard it from people from time to time, or even thought it in your own heart, is, well, yeah, okay, he's a judge here, and it's pretty devastating, the judgment he brings, but that's the Old Testament. That's God's dealing with sin in the Old Testament, but now it's different. Jesus came, Jesus taught love and peace and tolerance. God doesn't work like that anymore. But the truth is that God hasn't changed. God doesn't change. And sin is just as devastating here now in our current climate and our timeline, just as it was back then. And if we look at Jesus, we see that again and again and again in the Gospels he's warning against sin and the consequences of sin. Matthew 5, teaching on lust, he says this: if your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. For it is better that you lose one of your members than that your whole body be thrown into hell. So there Jesus takes what is seen as a private sin, perhaps, but no, he raises the bar. And he shows us that sin starts in the heart. Sin starts with a rebellion against God, and it has to be dealt with ruthlessly, because the consequences of it are eternal, thrown into hell. So don't soften sin. Don't be tempted to soften sin or think it's not that bad. And certainly don't ignore the reality of God's wrath, his hatred at sin. All sin will be punished eternally. So what impact should that have on us? If you're a Christian here tonight, well, firstly, it should cause you to grieve at your own sin. We should grieve. It should cause us to desire, to really long to live a holy life pleasing to God. Have you ever had that kind of experience as a Christian where you feel your own sinfulness and you just cry out to God? You mourn at your sin because you recognise that you're not living as God's called you to. Do you know, if you've not had that, if you're not experiencing that, it's probably because you're not sharing God's view of sin. And if that's the case, we'll bring that to him, talk to him about it, ask him to show you his heart, his anger at sin, his hatred of sin, so that you might have that in your own life as well. I think the second application here is to awaken us to the urgency of the gospel as we look around us. So look at maybe people in your own family. We look at friends, people we work with, neighbours. God judges impartially. And when we see them with the same eyes that God sees them, we recognise that all have sinned. And just like us, before coming to Christ, we fall short of that, of his standard, of his glory, and even the very best in human will, the very best in character. Well, when we come before God, they're like dirty rags. They're worthless. And without Christ, there is only judgment. Romans 1:18 tells us, for God's wrath is revealed from heaven against all godlessness. All godlessness. All sin. No exception. God's wrath is just and it's fair. And after hearing this prophecy, the people of Judah should have been so shocked that they should have completely repented and turned. And yeah, there is an indication that there is some kind of turning, but not in the long term. So we need to stop, we need to come, and we need to declare that without Christ, there is no hope. The challenge for us is that truth going to change the way we as Christians live? Is it going to change the way I see my family and my friends? God judges sin, and he does so impartially. But then if that's the case, is that it? Is there no hope? The first two chapters of Zephaniah, as God surveys his people and then these other nations, the verdict is that everyone's guilty. We're all guilty. There is no hope, surely. Everyone's chosen to rebel against him. Is it just a case really of waiting for this sentence to be carried out? Well, if that was the case, that would be pretty depressing. When I was young, maybe you had this as well, was there anything more terrifying than hearing the words, "Just wait till your father comes home"? Oh, that was bad, wasn't it? Just wait till your father comes home. You've done something wrong. Your mother's kind of tried to deal with it, but then, the ultimate threat, just wait till your father comes home. Is that what's happening here? Tough. Nothing you can do about it. Well, no, it's not. Because in this chapter we see thirdly that even in his judgment, God faithfully preserves a remnant. In 1988 there was a big wildfire that took place in Yellowstone National Park, and much of the landscape there was completely destroyed, turned to ashes. Everything was gone, charred, destroyed. Or so it seemed, because in the months afterwards, these green shoots, lots of green shoots, started to grow up amongst the ash. And that's because a certain type of pine cone there in that park only release their seeds when they come under intense heat. You see, the fire didn't actually destroy the future of the forest. It was actually preparing a way for it. Out of that devastation, out of that fire, seeds were released, they took root, and then over time, the forest came back even stronger. It flourished thicker than it had before. A remnant of that forest before was preserved, and then it flourished into something absolutely incredible. And remnant is a word that we pick up a couple of times in this chapter. We see it again in chapter 3. A remnant is something small that's kind of left over. When everything else is gone, a remnant is something small that's left over. We read in verse 7 of chapter 2, "The coastland will belong to the remnant of the house of Judah. They will find pasture there. They will lie down in the evening among the houses of Ashkelon. For the Lord their God will return to them and restore their fortunes." As God declares his verdict of judgment, of deserved judgment upon the earth, he says, but a remnant will be preserved. And in the literal sense of the people of Judah, that remnant would be taken into captivity, but they would continue to trust God. And then they would come back, and through people like Ezra and Nehemiah, they would come back from captivity and they would have the opportunity to rebuild Jerusalem. And then we would have that period leading all the way up to Jesus, where finally that remnant is preserved and leads to him. A promise that had been made hundreds, thousands of years before, that through the line of David, a Saviour was going to come. See, that's the thing about chapter 2, verse 7. It's not just pointing towards a small group of people who would survive captivity in Babylon. No, it looks much further. Actually, it's about the unfolding of God's plan of grace, a rescue plan for the entire world. About 600 years or so after Zephaniah writes down these words and tells the people this message, there's a man who's put to death on a Roman cross outside the city of Jerusalem. And this is no ordinary death. As he's there, hanging on the cross, darkness comes over the whole land at midday. The dead are raised to life as an earthquake. It shakes the ground. And all of creation, it seems, is just groaning. This incredible seismic, cataclysmic moment, the biggest moment in all of human history, as God himself, in the form of his Son, hangs on a cross. And there at the cross, God's judgment and God's mercy come together. And the wrath that Zephaniah is warning about here, the terrible things that we read about, that's going to be poured out upon those who rebel against him, his hatred at sin, it's poured out, but here it's not poured out on the guilty. No, it comes down on the innocent Son of God as Jesus takes his place on the cross and he stands in the way of sinners. Takes the judgment, so that this tiny remnant from this insignificant nation of Judah one day would become a vast, an enormous multitude of people, redeemed people, people from every single tribe and tongue and nation on the earth. They'll be more numerous than the sand on the seashore. And if you're a Christian today, you're part of that remnant. The story hasn't ended. You're part of the remnant that talked about here in Zephaniah. So what does that mean for us then? Well, if you're not a Christian, it means that you need Jesus. You need Jesus. Because only He can save you from the wrath to come. This wrath at your own sin, it's deserved. You've got to turn to Him. If you are a Christian, what does it mean for you? Well, it means that you need Jesus. It means that your friends, they need Jesus too. It means that your neighbours, the people who you work with, the people who you get on with and you love, the people in this town of Ramsey, they need Jesus. They need the God-man. He's beaten and He's dying there on the cross, but He cries out in victory, "It is finished." As He breathes His last, He's saying that the price is paid. The judgment that sinful men and women and boys and girls from that area of Jerusalem into Samaria and outwards to Rome and eventually to Ramsey 2025, those people in your family, in your streets, they can be saved. They can be part of this remnant that will be preserved and protected, and even more than that, that will be glorified and given such warmth and wonderful love in the family of God. So the challenge for us is, who's going to tell them? Who's going to warn them? Who's going to let them know that they're facing judgment? If you're a Christian, you are Christ's ambassador today. Just as God used Zephaniah to speak to His people all those years ago, today, if you're a Christian, He's using you. Where you are, whether it be in your home, in your workplace, could be here in the church, wherever you are. Do you know it's not an accident where He's placed you? Sometimes it might feel like that, but it's not. If you're His, you are His remnant, and He's using you exactly where you are to warn and to witness and to point people to the only hope there is, to Jesus Christ. That might seem like a challenge. That might seem difficult, and in some senses it is. But you're not doing it in your own strength. You're doing it in His. You get to share in this wonderful joy of knowing Him and telling others about Him. And I'd say to you, maybe you think, okay, I don't know how to do this. How do I go about this? That seems too big. Just focus on one person. Just think about one person, perhaps, and pray for them. Ask God to really lay them on your heart and to give you opportunity to speak to them, to share with them. Maybe just try and take that one opportunity and then see where it goes. But go to God and take that person to Him. See, Zephaniah 2, it is a sobering chapter, the whole of Zephaniah. Until you get to chapter 3, and then it's wonderful. It's sobering. This passage we've read, it teaches us that we can live with confidence, even though the world is tough, it's marred by this chaos. It tells us that God rules. He's sovereign. He rules supremely. It also tells us that we need to wake up. It tells us that God's judgment is real and it's coming and it's deserved. It's just, it's fair. But then it also tells us of God's grace and His mercy, ultimately found in Jesus. And you can know Him today. Why not turn to Him? If you don't know Him, turn to Him today. There is no better way to live, no greater friend and Saviour than Jesus Christ. Don't live another day on earth without Him. And if you do already, well then don't keep Him hidden. Share Him. Go, make Him known. Because the world, it needs this hope that only Jesus can give.